Uh, yeah. Good morning, Professor Atil. I'll begin as soon as I get a green signal from you or from the seminar committee. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Department of History, University of Delhi, I welcome you all on the second day of the Research Scholars Conference 2021. We will now begin our first session, Tradition, Modernity, and the Rewriting of History, chaired by Professor Amar Farooqui. We have 4 speakers in this session, and each will get 20 minutes to present their paper, followed by a discussion of 40 minutes in the end. The chair will remind the speaker of time at 15 minutes. Now, I request Professor Amar to please take over.
Okay, so let's begin today's session. Wish you all a very good morning and welcome to this session, the second day of the Research Scholars Conference of the Department of History, University of Delhi. This session is, as Soumya just said, on tradition, modernity, and rewriting of history, for which we have 4 papers. So without taking more time, I'll request the first speaker, Anas, to speak.
Okay, so
I invite you to speak about the role of colonial epistemology in the making of Emperor Aurangzeb as a villain.
Okay, thank you. So, can you hear me, everyone?
Yeah, very much.
Thank you so much. A very good morning to everyone. And this paper is still like, this title of my paper is the role of the colonial epistemology in making of Emperor Aurangzeb a villain. So in this paper, I'm going to look from 1700 to 1900, basically the first historiography, which was written by Alexander Doe. And then this paper, Alexander Doe to the Sydney Owen, who is writing in.
We can't see you. If you can turn,
Anas?
a video on.
So there's a connection issue here. So sorry for this. So this paper is a part of my ongoing MPhil dissertation, in which I am attempting to locate the relevance of colonial narrative in order to comprehend the contested construction of Emperor Aurangzeb in the colonial historiography, as they twisted, molded, and impacted the nationalist and the post-colonial narratives. So this is important to look into the colonial narrative to understand how the writing in the nationalist and the post-colonial period was actually constructed. So the narrative construction about the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb should be comprehended against the backdrop of knowledge production employed by the colonial government. The emergence of colonial knowledge production was determined by the involvement of colonial Orientalists in the Indian subcontinent from the second half of the 18th century to the early 20th century. I have employed the term Orientalist from Edward Said Orientalism, where he defines the Orientalist in a specific context of colonial intervention as hegemonic ascendancy or position in the study, research, and interpretation of Orient between the late 18th and early 20th century. These Orientalists, who could have been the colonial administrative officer, governor, civil servant, military officer, or a scholar from Europe, indulge in the activity of knowledge formation about the Orient following the conquest of territory. The major idea behind such epistemic formulation was based upon the creation of otherness between the Orient and Occident, with the idea of supremacy of Occident in the mind of Orientalists. Thus, the knowledge production, which was employed in the colonized territory, by having this idea of confirming the imperial authority in the mind of Orientalists. The colonial government, as a trading company, initiated the process of collecting historical texts, but as soon as they acquired territory in the subcontinent, the accumulating process intensified, since the sources are very important to read the history or the continuation of history, which was important feature of the colonial power to demark their authority. Bernard Cohen coined the term historical modalities to comprehend the process of historical writing that was an integral part of the colonial rule. The study of past has been an essential component of the knowledge formulation based upon the available known sources, whether indigenous or European material. And on that basis, they have constructed the categories, different kind of categories. And these categories I'm going to contextualize in context of Aurangzeb. So the interpretation of sources we see was obviously based upon the suiting the colonial narrative, and the narratology that they have applied to compile the history is based upon the contemporary historiography, which was prevalent in Europe. Nevertheless, the main purpose of historical writing was obviously to demarcate the distinction between the previous regime and their own rule, and moreover to identify themselves as a benevolent ruler of the subcontinent. The medieval period was depicted as a period of stagnation, decay, marked by medieval ruler discriminatory policy against the Hindu majority. So, however, this knowledge production was not uniform and constant throughout the colonial period, and this is what I am arguing in my paper. Because the Aurangzeb, when we look into the context of Aurangzeb was illustrated in the colonial historiography, over a period of time. He was built up as Aurangzeb, as a villain over a period of time. He was not a bigot in the initial compilation, but he was a despot, though. So there are three kinds of colonial composition that illustrate Emperor Aurangzeb. The first category of compilation written in comprehensive history of the subcontinent, that is obviously the history of Hindustan or history of India. The second category of work comprises biographical history of Emperor Aurangzeb, either in form of monograph or articles. The third category comprises the regional history, like the history of Banaras, and all these, history we can see, how all these accounts create a colonial narratives about the Aurangzeb. And these narratives are really interesting because these narratives are going to create a dominance. They're going to create a dominance in the 19th as well as the 20th century. So, and obviously, in the 19th century also, we can see how my major aim here is to demonstrate the shift and transformation in the narrative in the colonial historiography about Aurangzeb, basically from the second half of the 18th century to the late 19th century, from a benevolent ruler, because in the initial writing, he was depicted as a benevolent ruler, but over a period of time, he was depicted as a Muslim bigot and then Sunni bigot. And these writings, when you look into or dwell into the colonial writing, it actually tells us how the narrative on Aurangzeb has been built up. So the first detailed record of Aurangzeb appear in the composition of the colonial officers come Orientalist. Obviously, when we look into Alexander II, he was an officer, he was an infant, he was a army person, he was in the infantry of the Bengal East India Company. And he has written this interesting work, The History of Hindustan, from the death of Akbar to the complete settlement of empire under Aurangzeb. And this was written in 1772. This was the very first comprehensive history of the subcontinent written following the conquest of territory by the British East India Company. His account minutely discussed cover the regional history of Aurangzeb, running into 7 chapters, and then he talks about he begins his narration with the war of succession among the Shah Jahan's son, and end with the administrative appraisal of Aurangzeb. So most of the information, because Alexander II is writing, he extracted the information basically from the regional material or the material from the subcontinent. Basically, the account of Muhammad Kazim Khan's Alamgir Nama, Bakhtawar's Khan, Miratul Alam, and Ruzname of Aurangzeb reign was basically incorporated. The sources were incorporated to write the history or to construct history of Aurangzeb. On these basis, we see his observation of Aurangzeb is very contrasting from the subsequent colonial history that emerged in the mid-19th and the late 19th century. In his writing, Aurangzeb was shown as affectionate parent, sincere friend, and a just master. He was not shown as a bigot the way we see in the writing of the 19th century, who had done a great deed for his subject. His rule saw the continuation of the religious policy of the previous Mughal ruler, in which people of other religious beliefs were not persecuted. So Alexander II considered him as a most competent, worthy, and ablest son of Shah Jahan, who had revealed his efficiency, and skill since his childhood. Unlike the Mughal princes, other Mughal princes, he was devoted to the learning the language, law, custom of the subcontinent, but unlike his brothers. So, and when he's talking about Aurangzeb's ability in war and administration, he considered Mughal nobility sided him during the War of Succession because seeing his quality, not because he's using the religious connotation the way we see in the subsequent historiography. So, though illustration of Aurangzeb as a benevolent ruler in administrative matter are based upon administrative transparency in accumulating a knowledge of the subcontinent, knowledge of the state revenue paid by the every district, and effective measure to curb the exploit of the state official, and judges were appointed in the distinct provinces. He paid people impacted by the War of Succession. But again, the War of Succession, when we look into the account of Alexander II and read the War of Succession, in the War of Succession, Aurangzeb always has seen how in the 19th century, how he actually used this term of Mussalman, or he used this term or projected him as a Muslim bigot. But in his writing, he was not projecting him as a bigot, but actually he actually talked about him as a ruler who was selected by the nobility and fought the battle with his brother because of his ability and quality, not because of the bigot nature. According to Doe, he was also in the matter of justice, Aurangzeb also invincible, vigilant, and exact, and the sophisticated form of the Mughal judiciary and justice system were made less intricate, so that ordinary people could access them without much hindrance. The court of petition from the inferior court to the superior court was unchanged, unbroken, and the judges were subjected to the trial in the event of the lapse in justice. He was also seen as a builder. He also patronized various monuments for his subject, unlike his former ruler. Unlike a former ruler of the Mughal dynasty, who built mostly for the splendid purpose. So many houses and sarais were ordered to be built and built for the use of traveler. And Emperor Aurangzeb he was seen to be founded many university in the principal town, and that's why, and obviously, this was paid from the public treasury. That this is what he's arguing on the basis of the account that he extracted from the subcontinent and writing about the Aurangzeb. So it was the very first representation of Aurangzeb in the colonial narrative. He was shown as a just ruler who kept his quality and ambition over religion, unlike the later interpretation of the mid-19th and early 20th century. Until the first decade of the 19th century, it was widely held by the Orientalists that Emperor Aurangzeb had created the most prosperous empire in the world for his successor. It was his successor who were unable to centralize their control over such a vast territory under his reign. So Thomas Morris, The Fall of Mughal, he has written this work, The Fall of Mughal, a Tragedy, in 1806. Argues that the weak successor factionalism within the nobility and successive invasion of Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah Abdali made it more fragile and close to collapse condition. Unlike the 19th century and unlike the mid-19th and early 19th century, in the colonial narration, in which he was seen as a sole cause behind the decline of Mughal empire because of his religious bigotry. So the history was written. History was written in the 19th and 17th century. I'm going to talk about the background. So why history was written in terms of explicit category of Hindu and Muslim. So the colonial narratives about Emperor Aurangzeb take different turn in the shifting intellectual discourse of the colonial knowledge formation in the 19th century. And the most influential intellectual of such methodology was James Neal, who retired from the highest post in East India Company in Britain. And he, when he's writing in 1817, his writing History of British India, it became a hegemonic work for methodological and theoretical purpose to read the history of the subcontinent. And it provided a model to subsequent Orientalists to write the history in explicit category of Hindu and Muslim. And through Meal's framework, medieval Muslim ruler presented not only as despotic, but oppressive toward Hindus, with some interlude of ruler like Akbar. So the oppressive narrative of Hindu majority turmoil under Muslim minority was so embedded in the colonial historiography of imperial government under one dominant connotation of jizya, temple demolition, and forced conversion. So therefore, it also caused the advent of the first contested interpretation of Emperor Aurangzeb within the subsequent colonial writing. And it should be observed in the writing of first contested interpretation of Aurangzeb emerged in the writing of Mount Stuart Elphiston. And when Elphiston is writing his history of India, the Hindu and Mohammedan period in 1841, and he's actually bringing or creating certain category, which is very important to in vilification of Aurangzeb in the later historiography. And then we also see the posthumous paper of H.M. Eliot, compiled and edited by the John Dawson under title History of India as told by its own historian in 1877. And these two accounts almost entirely relied on the Muhammad Hasim Khan, also known as Kafi Khan's Muntakhabul Lubab, written almost 30 years after the demise of Aurangzeb. And these texts, this text was obviously, when we look into the writing of Mount Stuart Elphiston and H.M. Eliot, they have used this text to demonize Aurangzeb. And in these writing, when we look into the writing of Kafi Khan Muntakhabul Libab, how they have interpreted, selectively to demarcate the bigoted notion or the bigoted connotation, or to demarcate Aurangzeb as a bigot ruler in the mid 19th century. So we also see in these writing the earliest benevolent, because of these writing and the subsequent writing in the 19th century by Stanley Lanepool, who is writing solely on Aurangzeb, and then solely one monograph on Aurangzeb, and then The Ruin of Aurangzeb by W.W. Hunter. And in these work, we see Aurangzeb was depicted because of the contested, basically the information that is coming from is basically from H.M. Eliot and Dawson's rendering that they have translated to read.
Unless you have about 5 minutes more. Okay,
I'll conclude my point. So when we look into the historiography of the late 19th and early 20th century, Aurangzeb was depicted as a man of mild temper and the cold heart and the cautious, artful, and designing, a perfect master of dissimulation, and the promoter of his religion by temple demolition, by destroying the idol and all, and by bringing different policies, which was obviously marking his rule as a bigoted rule. So in these narrative which emerged from the 19th century, Aurangzeb was depicted as a anti-Hindu. So the religious, he was depicted as a religious Puritan in nature, who imposed atrocities upon Hindu through temple demolition, removal from the government offices, imposition of discriminatory tax jizya, which forced them to go against his governance. Further, the categorical binary established by Orientalists like governance under liberal Akbar were juxtaposed against the governance under Orthodox Aurangzeb. Similarly, heroic sea exploit of Maratha under Hindu Shivaji against Muslim Aurangzeb, undertaken to dominate the colonial narrative from the mid 19th century. So by the late 19th and early 20th century, this category became more explicit and sharper in the colonial narrative, with a new category of Sunni Puritan, whose action equally harassed Shia too. So the conquest of Bijapur and Golconda, two of the Dakhini Sultanate, is the dominant justification for his anti-Shia policy. So now Aurangzeb in the 19th century, in the writing of Stanley Lanepool and the writing of W.W. Hunter, he was not just projected as a Sunni Puritan, but as a Hindu bigot, but as a Sunni Puritan. So and also the cause for the decline of empire, was and the downfall of empire was and mark him as the downfall of Mughal empire was basically demarcated and given responsibility of the downfall of empire to the Aurangzeb. So So a certain categorical bind that I wanted to speak about today, so which is about Hindu Shivaji and Muslim Aurangzeb. So when we look into the Elphiston's writing, he also talks about first, like, no, why these people are revolting, and this is also depicted in the depicted the Hindu people, like, why are Hindus revolting against Aurangzeb? So basically, because he imposed certain rule and regulation, which was basically coming from or inspired from the Muslim laws. And this is why, like, the Hindus are revolting against the Muslim. And later interpretation in the 19th century shifted suddenly to the Sunni Puritan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anas, for that, for your paper, and a lot to think about, because this is a theme, as we all know, of a lot of contemporary relevance. So now we'll move on to, we'll have the discussion after all the four speakers have made their presentation. So we'll move on to the next paper, which is, I'll invite Ghazala Rasheed, who'll be talking about Puritanism, Radicalism, and Resistance, the genesis of Wahhabi ideology in the city of Azimabad during the 19th century.
Good
Ghazala?
morning, sir. Yes, sir. Good morning, sir. And thank you very much. Sir, actually, I have some range issues, so my camera won't be working. So,
Okay.
Okay, sir. Sir, so shall I start?
Yes, yes. Please, please do. Please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. So the title of my paper is Puritanism, Radicalism, and Resistance, the genesis of Wahhabi ideology in the city of Azimabad during the 19th century. In this, my main focus will be on Wahhabism movement in the area of Azimabad, how and why Azimabad emerged and remained as the main center. Patna is one of the oldest cities of India, have been founded by Ajashatru in the 6th century BC. Patliputra, Kusumpur, and Patligram were some of its earlier names. Another and more commonly named was Azimabad after Muhammad Azam in 1705, the favorite grandson of Aurangzeb, who got title of Azimus Shan later by his father Shah Alam I. He divided the old city into several quarters, giving them the names of Mughalpura, Lodi Katra, Diwani Mohalla, Dawalpura, etc. M. Martin, in his text, Eastern India, did a case study of Azimabad in which he discussed about the condition of the inhabitants, like their social condition, education of youth, revenue system, the state of the landed property, and of the tenures by which it was held, which had affected agriculture. He further said that the Muslims' populations comprised of 27% of the whole, or about 9,24,000 persons. Mohammedans converts were occasionally made from pagans, especially by the purchase of slaves who were treated with great kindness. People were divided into Ashraf, Bukals, Ponyas, and Jyotiyas. The Ashraf were a kind of gentry and consisted of the high caste, both Muslims and Hindu, namely Sayyids, Pathans, Mughals, etc. Ashraf have multiplied so enormously. The greater part of them not only have lands which they cultivated on their own accounted by means of slaves or servants, but a very large proportion cultivated with their own hands. The poorest of them, however, abstained from acting as servants, and they only worked on their own farms. They chose division of Ashraf, upper Ashraf, middle Ashraf, and lower Ashraf. So the establishment of British rule in India affected different classes of Muslims in different ways. For a minority, it destroyed not a livelihood, but a way of life. Life under British patronage was probably materially worst. The Muslims cultivators, zamindar and talukdar suffered a lot from the introduction of landlordism. W. Hunter described the Muslims as in all respects a race ruined under British rule. British rule profoundly changed the relationship of the landed class. A caste Muslim landholder commonly believed to have suffered greatly from the British rule. They were the recipients of the revenue-free grants from the officials of the Mughal Subedar. However, after the grant of the Diwani to the English East India Company, stringent measures were adopted for the financial resources, and consequently, the revenue-free grants were resumed. The families of the grantees became the main victims of such policies of the East India Company. W. Hunter has graphically described the most disastrous impact of this policy on the institution of Indo-Islamic learning and marginalization of the Indo-Islamic elite of Eastern India. The economic depravity of the marginalized Indo-Islamic elite ultimately resulted in the ideological opposition of the colonial rule. Some Muslims were prepared to object publicly. They were those who, as Muslim scholars, did not care to see the express commands of God openly disregarded, those upon whom British rule was quicker to take effect, and those who had no expectation. By this time, the Wahhabis and Frizis have started taking roots among the Muslims of Upper Ganges Valley. The people of Azimabad became a recipient of this radical ideology. So my main focus will be on this, as I was earlier saying, this question of Wahhabi movement, why it started, how and why Azimabad emerged and remained as the main center. So Wahhabi movement was started by Saeed Ahmad of Raebareli in the first quarter of the 19th century, sought to implement some social religious reform. At the same time, he was conscious of the political situation in the country, particularly the increasing British political domination and the need to combat it. Wahhabism was a puritanical form of Sunni Islam and was practiced in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. The word Wahhabi was derived from the name of a Muslim scholar, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, who lived in the Arabian Peninsula during the 18th century. Later, this term Wahhabism broadly applied outside the Arabian Peninsula to refer to a Sunni Islamic movement that seeks to purify Islam of any innovations or practice that deviate from the 7th century teaching of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. W. W. Hunter, in his work, The Indian Musulmans, had taken Wahhabi in a very negative sense. He had painted and framed it in a negative sense, which has acted like a spark which leads to the wildfire among the British government. Hunter had used certain inappropriate terms for Wahhabis like fanatics, traitors, infidels. He has been regarded as the progenitor of Muslim separatism and has even linked with a deliberate official policy of divide and rule. Hunter gave a description apparently on the basis of his personal knowledge of a Wahhabi preacher in a Mufassil town. In the eyes of the British government, the word Wahhabi was synonymous with trade general. Thus, by describing the followers of Sayyid Ahmad as Wahhabis, the contemporary government officers aimed at killing two birds with one stone, branding them as rebels in the higher circles of the government and as extremists and desecrators of shrine in the eyes of the general Muslims. Wahhabis admitted the right of ijtihad, that is, right to form judgment independent of the four schools of Islamic jurisprudence on matters of law and theology, and strictly emphasized the principle of Tawheed, that is monotheism, and the discarding of Bidat, that is in religious and social matters. They based themselves primarily on the Quran and Hadith. The movement was launched in Bihar during the course of Sayyid Ahmad's missionary tour of the state in 1823 or 24. He halted at various places in Bihar, that is Buxar, Chhapra, Dinapur, Patna, Bar, Munger, Bhagalpur, and Rajmahal. And in these places, very large number of people took bath. That is a formula of fealty signifying the acceptance of one's spiritual preceptor. The Wahhabi movement had two important aspects: social, religious, and political. Former regarding the preaching of certain social and religious reforms, and the latter the urging for the struggle against the Britishers. Some steps were taken for the first time in Patna to set up an organizational base. Muhammad Hussain was appointed as Khalifa, that is duly authorized deputy, to enroll new members and organize the movement generally in Bihar. Later, Sayyid Ahmad was joined by a number of his followers from Bihar, including Vilayat Ali and Inayat Ali, that is sons of Sfat Ali. These members gave a greater cohesiveness to the organization, created a well-knit training center at Patna with a number of subordinate zones and circles. Patna now became and remained till the very end the chief Wahhabi center in British India, and the large complex of residential houses, hospices, and mosques belonging to the Wahhabi leaders of Sadikpur became the headquarters. It was referred to as the Khalifa in the secret courts of the Wahhabis and labeled the Karwan Sarai for rebels and traitors by Hunter, who gave a vivid account of this place. Like Hunter said, in the Musalman quarter of the ancient city of Patna, there is an alley called Sadikpur Lane. On the left side of the alley is a group of buildings in Moorish style, considerable frontage and running back some distance from the lane. The prominent edifice of the group is a mosque in which public prayer is held every hour of the day and the khutbah or lecture is delivered every Friday. The Maulvis of the other city mosques, while forced to acknowledge the learning and eloquence of the Sadikpur Lane preachers, denounce them as Unitarians, Semistics. Around the mosque are the dwelling houses of the priests, with a small college for the students of the Reformed theology, a hospice for pious travelers. Patna leaders gave a greater cohesiveness to the organization by developing a training center at Patna with a number of subordinate zones and circles all over the country, and organizing a dedicated band of itinerant preachers. On the financial side, a successful attempt was made to utilize traditional items of Muslims' charities such as sadaqah, khairat, and distributions of goat, sheep, and cow skin on the occasion of Bakrid. It was this organizational base built up by the efforts of a host of silent, unobtrusive workers which sustained the heroic struggle of the Wahhabis. A notable feature of the Wahhabi organizational work was the promotion of a corporate and civic spirit among the villagers and an attitude of civil disobedience to the government. Like, people were urged not to take their cases to government courts, but to get them settled in panchayat-like bodies, and also not to seek employment under government. Another very significant aspect was the attempt to infiltrate into the ranks of the Indian units of the British Indian Army. The economic undercurrent of the movement may also be briefly noticed. The Wahhabis took advantage of the ground prepared by the Frizis in Bengal to consolidate their position among the peasants of that area. They worked for the cause of the landless peasants and tried to weld them into a well-knit organization. They afforded them protection against the unjust advice by the zamindars and against the operations of the British planters. It was this aspect of the work which prompted the planters to take lead in the suppression. The movement remained dormant for some time after the death of Sayyid Ahmad, but it was revived under the leadership of the Ali's brothers, that is, Vilayat Ali and Inayat Ali played a decisive role in the revival and the sustenance of the movement during the period after the death of Sayyid Ahmad. Why Azimabad emerged as the important center of Wahhabi movement? As mentioned above, that Patna became the chief Wahhabi center in British India, though this movement in Calcutta and other region like northern province also emerged, but was not that successful. The reason was that here in Azimabad, a class of Muslim landholders had suffered greatly from British rule. The prevailing discontent in Azimabad against the government, owing to some of its social and economic...
Ghazala,
Okay.
you have about 5 minutes more.
Okay, sir. I'll try to wind up.
Yeah.
The land
continue.
resumption. Okay, the land resumption proceedings and the activities of the missionaries also added to the list of grievances of the people. The fears and apprehension of the people were carefully utilized by anti-government agitators. According to Peter Hardy in his text, the Muslims of British India says that the majority of Muslims cultivators and landholders were converts or descendants of converts whose relationship to the soil was the same as that of the non-Muslims among whom they lived. British land and revenue policies affected them in the same way as they affected non-Muslims of the same status and relationship to land. The British encountered a system of land tenure, which though did not always recognize it to be so, was complex in detail but simple in principle. Land was occupied and cultivated by families, clans, and tribes. The British desired a land system which would ease the task of collecting the state's traditional share of the gross produce of the soil, promote agricultural production, and create a loyal class of landholders. They abhorred and did not understand an agrarian society based on customs and tradition in which land afforded a period of imprecise qualified rights to a share in its produce rather than a clear doctrine of unqualified and absolute possession. In the works of Montgomery Martin, Eastern India, it is mentioned that the government of India, having the sovereignty of the India, exacted a rent in proportion to the produce. According to the public records, the whole land that has been measured being 5,520,541 bighas, and the free land so far also it has been measured being 1,510,437 bighas. It forms 37.5% of the whole. This proportion was materially erroneous, as considerable extents of land have not been measured and probably nearly in the same properties in both kinds. As M. Martin were not aware of the nature of the tenures in the parts of Bihar districts, he perceives that in the area of Shahbad, almost the whole there belongs to Mohammedans, and this is also the case in the other parts. Indeed, there is a strong reason to think that almost every grant which the Hindus occupied has been procured by forgery. Other forgery prevailed on the first occupancy of power by the company's servant, and that during the Mughal government, no grants of land were tolerated for the support of idolatry of a pagan priesthood. The free land has been granted for the following, like Al-Tamgha lands granted in perpetuity as an award for spending military action or for the support of a noble family, registered at 2,82,037 biga. Jagir land granted to a military officer for his support, registered at 2,24,252 bigas. Jagir Pasman land granted for the support of watchman. Besides free land, the invalid establishment obtained 24,194 bigas of the measure. The whole belongs to zamindars who are forcibly seized on a part. The minute subdivision property was reduced by far the greater part of the zamindars to the condition of mere peasants, and many of them could not live decently without cultivating their lands on their own account. Division of property was, however, its advantage as well as losses. Small zamindars were certainly less oppressive to their tenants and more obedient to government. So according to the public account, Azimabad contains about 1,10,644 bigas, which 53,982 were not passed. According to the space which it occupied on the map, that besides rivers, roads, it contains about 2,27,000 bigas. That is more than double of what it was supposed to do when assessed. The assessed land in the same manner at 1,16,700 bigas, which pays 56,347 rupees, and were burdened with 1,561 bigas granted to the invalid establishment. Then even the education system was also not good, like schoolhouses were built in a form of hut. In parts of the country where sugar cane grows, the boiling houses usually serves for a school. The profits of a teacher were as usual very small. The study of Persian was used for a revenue record purpose. In the appendix, Martin has mentioned the outcome of his inquiries regarding the state of common education and the number of schoolmasters and teachers. There were 7 Maulvis who instructed youth in the higher branches of Persian literature and Arabic science, but both were very much neglected. The Nawabs of Bengal established a madrasa at Patna, and Maulvi occasionally resides, but was often absent and was merely makes a form of teaching. There were besides a good many persons who had acquired the title of Maulvi, but they did not teach, and some of them were probably rather shallow. Even in Tazkira Sadiqpur of Hazrat Maulana Abul Rahim says that Sadiqpuri family was against English education as their fear of moving away from Islam. They wanted knowledge to be based on Islamic teaching. In order to save Islam, they organized Anjuman Islamia Jalsa in Patna College in order to discuss about Islam. So they won't be away from Islamic knowledge. They were indulged in Arabic, Urdu, and Persian knowledge. As steady flow of volunteers from all walks of life kept pouring in the head for receiving instruction in the doctrine of the sect and getting training in the more arduous work of missionaries and recruits. During the period of revival under the Ali brothers, the Khalifa at Patna was Yahya Ali. His duties included public ministrations in the mosque, lecturing to the students on doctrinal points corresponding with the district centers. The Wahhabis were dedicated and self-effacing band of workers who traversed over the whole country, spreading their message into the interior areas and collecting funds for the movement. Their teachings were guarded mixtures of expounding the necessity of social reforms and that of struggle against the foreign rules. Contributions of the Bahavi movement. The measure of its success in the social religious field was
Ghazala, you'll have to conclude. You'll have to conclude. Just about half a minute. Take half a minute to conclude.
Okay. Thus, to conclude, I would say that if you're supporting and acting like a zombie without questioning, working according to the government, then you are best. The moment you started questioning and demanding your own right in your own country, then you will be tagged as traitor, infidels, conspirators, like Wahhabi movement's leaders Inayat Ali and Vilayat Ali. Among the modern reform movements in Indian Islam, Wahhabi movement was one of the most vigorous and influential. The fact that Azimabad served as its organizational base indicates that it enjoyed wide support in that area. The movement has received some response from different sections of the society like ulema, the Sufis, gentry, and the professional group. Starting originally under social religious impulse, the Wahhabi movement gained a political orientation, particularly during the period of the leadership of the Ali's brothers and afterwards. The Wahhabi movement was a highly centralized one and respected role of its centers inside British India. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Ghazala, for that paper and taking us to Patna of that the 19th century and its upheavals. We now move on to the next speaker, which is Hukum Chandra, who will be talking about caste interactions through Bhakti of Ramanandi, Vaishnava, Sadhus, Awadh 20th century.
With your permission, I just would like to intervene for to encourage our speakers to present with videos on, because we are also Facebook Live. This is going to be on YouTube. So it is an opportunity for our presenters to be seen, to be speaking in these times of Facebook Live and selfie-giri and all that. So, it is a good idea actually to speak with whatever level of preparedness with video on rather than just the voice. I think Hukum Chandra will be speaking with video on. Already we have seen him here.
Yeah, Hukum Chandra.
Yeah, I'm audible, sir.
Yes, yes, very much audible and visible both.
Very good morning to all of you. This paper was my ongoing research and some part I did in my field trip, various monasteries in Awadh before 2019. I selected 25 monasteries and 11 from Rajput head monastery and 10 from Brahman head monasteries and 4 from other lower communities. This study focused on the philosophy of Ramanandi sect and social implication. Specifically, I attempt to explain how the reformist tradition, that is Ramanandi, began itself with the goal to update the social and behavior other feudalistical information practice. Eventually, itself in the embedded say most of the importantly how the caste practice began to spill in the developing of monastery with the all pervasive impact. Caste is definitely an important phenomena in the Ramanandi tradition. The caste system is exceptional to the Indian civilization. However, the emergence of caste system is highly constructed issue. And here I started for the establishment of Ramanandi sect. On the earliest writing recorded the Ramanandi is found the Nabhas Bhaktmala of 16. Although the author of Nabhavad himself, a Ramanandi Bhakt, consisted important non-sectarian work of Vaishnava Historiography. However, the connection between this work and Ramanandi Sampradaya is certainly not of the minor significance. In the early 20th century, influence of the commentary on the Bhaktmal was authored by Ramanandi named was Bhagwan Prasad, and his commentary was the Roop Kala. This commentary considered as the both scholarly and authoritative as well as celebration of the Ramanandi Sampradaya. Roop Kala expanded the Nabhas account of Ramanand by provide detail of birth, initiation and circumstances led the founding of separate sampradaya. According to Bhagwan Prasad Roop Kala account, Ramanand was born in Ramdat in 13 in Prayag. After that, he travelled in various holy places across India. According to Roop Kala, when Ramanand followed the initiate entry, refused him the entry into the sampradaya after the travel and his violation of the caste commensality, and it is after founded his own sampradaya, Ramanandi Sampradaya. Bhagwan Prasad Roop Kala sub commentary on the Bhaktmal. This account included in immediately after Nabha's brief verses placing Ramanand in lineage of Ramanujas. This hagiographical account of Ramanand supplement Nabha's brief description and more importantly supplies the detail of the conflict that led the founding of Ramanandi Sampradaya, the basis of which is disagreement created around the rigidity of Ramanandi Vaishnava caste rule. Writing in the early 20th century, commentary on the Bhaktmal was published over the 6-year period of 1903 to 1909. Bhagwan Prasad commentary Roop Kala come at a time when the Ramanandi Sampradaya was going through its latest crisis in identity. The debate which is centered question of whether Ramanand over belonging in the lineage of Ramanuja is reflected in the Bhagwan Prasad commentary. By the emphasizing the orthodoxy and rigidity of Southern Sri Vaishnava, it was prevented way for the final schism between the Ramanandis and Ramanujis. According to the Roop Kala commentary, Sitaram Bhagwan Prasad was the great scholar of Ramanandi tradition and Ramanuja was endorsed by the agreement of Ujjain in 1921. However, this Ramanandi sect established a lineage system of caste reform. Bhagwan Prasad also included a lineage of Ramanandi Sampradaya, and Sri Mahant Sampradaya in Sri Ramanuja is markedly absent. Bhagwan Prasad was also, however, writing in dialogue with the prominent historian and Indologist of his time. Instead, interestingly, in the otherwise largely historiographical narrative, Bhagwan Prasad cited in authority of his scholar, for instance, to lend credibility to proposed historical date of Ramananda 1300 to 1411. Two prominent Indologists, J. N. Farquhar and George Grierson, both who took interest in the religion and vernacular literature in North India, forbrought the Ramanandis. J. N. Farquhar, a missionary and Indologist, attended the Kumbh Mela in Allahabad in 1980, where his attention was drawn. The Ramanandi was being a most numerous next to the Dasnami Saivite in article published in Journal of Royal Aesthetic Society. Dimension the connection between the Ramanandi and Ramanuja based on the various differences in ritual and practice. However, he believed that the south origin of Ramanandi sect based on the Adhyatma Ramayana and Agast Sahita Sanskrit work composed by south referring to the Ram worship. He claimed that the Ramanand belonging to the long extinct sect for the Ram worship for the south, making him an early scholar. Scholars to propose south origin for the Ramanand. Farquhar also dismissed the claim that the Ramanand propagated an anti-caste doctrine. In a response to this article in 1921, Rai Bahadur Lala Sitaram protested these claims, though obviously he has claimed that the Ramanand never failed to acknowledge that the teaching were derived from the Ramanuja. From later, a name is daily pronounced by the every point of Ramanandi in the Guru's Parampara. Sitaram was the regular correspondent of George Grierson, who is the 1980 had published an article in Ramanandis. Grierson corresponded with Sitaram's son Bhagwan Prasad, a draw so much of the information from sub-commentary on the Bhaktamal. Grierson endorsed the Bhagwan Prasad's view. Ramanand was the North India, Prayag in Allahabad, and having been initiated in Sri Vaishnava sect, left to found his own sect in liberal view on the caste rule. However, as been suggests, this scholarly disagreement must be read in the context of the debate within the Ramanandi community. According to Pinch, Grierson and Farquhar, representations and suggestions that the Sampradaya discord of 1980 and 1921 was producing a scholarly agreement in the page of Indological Research in London. Farquhar refutation of the connection between the Ramanand and Ramanuja was the being opposed the two level. Last time was defending a Sampradaya's connection on ancient and hence authoritative tradition. Grierson, on the other hand, Ramanand as a reformer who was the responsible for the spreading Ramanuja doctrine of Bhakti, but without referencing the caste in the Ramanandi reformist agenda. It was in the late 19th and early 20th century, there began a conscious effort of many historians to focus on the issue of caste in the making Indian social history. This evoked an analytical and critical examination is assumptions that the historian of the early generation had made. It is believed that the caste mentality abundant in the Indian mind, the caste identity has emerged as the powerful force in contemporary Indian politics, with the various caste groups to remove the inequality and exploitation created by his age-old institution. Therefore, in the order to get clear picture of these various movements and the socio-cultural and political change that led to the in the social outlook of sect in the 19th and 20th century, which are seen within the sect. The caste temples can also be through the process of being built in the all over Awadh. According to the Grierson, in Ramanandi designated the Ramanandi and Ramavad was ambiguous. Is attracted to the lower Sudra communities into the sect. The caste exists within the Ramanandi sect as form. A core group of Ramanandi sadhus held a religious doctrine based around the new concept of Ramanandi, which rejected caste as all that was the inherent in it. However, the practical reality is that caste had always been the Ramanandi sect, especially in the my area of my study. This might probably the largest and most influential religious order in North India, early 19th and late 20th century. Therefore, difference within 20th century in the sect, the question of Varna status become difficult to resolve. The caste is still a complex issue. It is evolved from the reformist issue of Ramanandi sect and exists as the caste mobilization. Thus, therefore, its significance regions in think that the caste is historically specific, manipulable, and ultimately a function of individual opinion. I interestingly use the present verbal term to describe the caste status because most of the sadhus themselves discuss their caste identity along with their ascetic identity in their renouncing discourse. The Ramanandi sadhu even inquire about the caste of other sadhus whom they meet first time. On one occasion, where another sadhu invited to other sadhus from her ashram and regarding to satsang after asking her guru brother about the caste. For the Rajput and Brahman sadhus in the particular to discuss caste particular who belong to particular community, the Vaishnava community of Kurmi and Yadav as individual ascetic self-representation, and he always to discuss the own community. According to these sadhus, the caste jati, which is individual, is born determine his inner nature or personality. In Hindi, subhav, the caste as believed indicate the sadhu inherent ability to withstand the spiritual difficulty ascetic life. The Rajput and Brahman sadhus I interacted with the attribute their own ascetic devotional power to their high caste background, while they do not deny that sadhu from other caste can develop the power to withstand spiritual challenge. These sadhus also admit that his power to natural to the member of their caste. Rajput sadhu, for example, talk about their courage and bravery in himmat, not only from the bhakti of Bhagwan, but also from the being a born into the from warrior Rajput family. Some of the sadhus even attribute their bhakti to their high caste. For example, Mayanath, a Rajput sadhu, attribute the Rajput capacity for the selfless devotion toward the history of the bravery of their caste and families they belong to. Although they emphasize importance of their own caste, the sadhu appears to be indifferent to the caste of their devotee. They indicate that their statement that they can become ritually impure neither by the feeding their low caste devotee nor by accepting the food of low caste devotee, because as a sadhu they remain unaffected by the relative purity impurity of householders. Many of the sadhus have low caste devotee whom they regularly serve with love and respect, but would be restricted from the preparing food. However, do not ignore the caste distinction among the ascetics in their tradition. Rather, he asked if the caste is not known. आपका शरीर क्या है? या आप गुरु घर से पहले आपका घर कौन था? Likewise, example, the sadhu were after all born into the particular caste, and the introduction upbringing does not.
Chandra, you have about 5 minutes more.
Okay. In correspondence, the Jar's son Lala Sitaram noted in the late 19th century, Ramanandi brought up disciples from all those jatis from what could be taken. This means Jati, Pure, Sudra, and including the Kayastha, Mali, Halwai, and Badai, and some agriculture community like Kori, Kurmi, and Gwala. Here also the pointed out that exception made by high Varna Hindus in the major Ramanandi Akhada headquarters in Hanuman, Ayodhya. Moreover, also noted the visit of any Akhada of Ramanandi Bairagi will convince that the Sudra of all classes are freely admitted, invested in the sacred twist born in the regard of it can be assumed those who are given in the Ramanandi Akhadas had pattern of division according to the rank of position of Varna, did not unite everywhere in the question, but still he question arise whether he non-twist born retained his Varna status from the becoming Ramanandi Bairagi. The view forward of Bhagavatachar, it is the among renunciated there is no Varna system at all. At Vaishnava Brahman family. However, in context of the Raghurachar held that the Varna system does in fact existing among the renunciations, and Brahman remain a Brahman, Shudra remain a Shudra, and the could be never eat together at a time. Dasin hold the pole, arguing that the Sudra, Vaishnava who hold all qualities can be considered pure in all respect. This purity is ornamental and is not the same as everywhere else. When the Ramanandi started reforming, there are talks on the caste reform in which many examples are found that sadhus of the deprived community consider caste were represented and gradually in various forms were seen periphery of the change in which we see it is how the caste which once talk about the caste reform started dividing in the form of caste and social form being to form which today reflects on reality of Ramanandi sect, which is the process of the construction of the caste temple all over the Awadh. Somewhere in the early stage, there is culmination of the caste discrimination within the monastery. Many of these out the social art in the time they appear from away from the old form, both opposite caste discrimination and construction of monastery and temples of the caste identity appears to be contradictory to each other. In nowadays, in Awadh, many districts had established a caste monastery to protest of discrimination within the Ramanandi sect of different castes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chandra, again for this paper, which, as you know, the Ramanandis, there's been a great deal of, this is of great contemporary relevance also because there's a great deal of interest in the Ramanandis and their ideas in the context of contemporary politics also. So thank you so much. We'll now move on to the next speaker, the fourth speaker in this session, Umair Hamid, who will be speaking on the scandalous embrace, religion, nation, and historiography. Umair?
So I think Umair, he's not here in the meeting. And there's no information also. So you're on mute.
Yeah, I also cannot see his name in the screen.
So maybe, sir, we can continue with the discussion.
Yeah. So Soumya, I think we'll then in that case, we've had these three wonderful papers and many of the issues that they have raised and the questions that they are focused on, as I said, are of continuing relevance, and I'm sure we'll have a fruitful discussion on these papers. So I invite questions, comments, observations on these three papers, Anas, Ghazala, and Hukum Chandra's paper. Okay, so if there isn't anything immediately while others are kind of
we have a hand raised.
Ask?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Soumya, I'll leave you to conduct this.
Okay, so there's a hand raised by Akshit Raj. Can you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, so my question is for Anas. Anas, thank you so much for this wonderful and insightful paper. Sorry. So my question is specifically on the first half of modern era, that is early modern era. I just wanted to seek your attention on the ideological framework of epistemology. Like, this is episteme, okay, where every episteme is based on a particular reason. So I just wanted to know this episteme which have been created towards for Aurangzeb, what was the basis of this episteme? Why was it being created in this particular moment? If Alexander Daw is writing as one of the earliest Orientalists, why is he focusing on Aurangzeb, and what does he want to objectify from this particular symbol?
Okay, yes, thank you for your question, Akshit. So my concern when I was looking into the Alexander Doe, so why he's writing about Aurangzeb is interesting because it's not just about Aurangzeb. He compiled a history of Hindustan and the history of Hindustan into two parts, and then in that, in the second part, he's talking about Aurangzeb, and in that basically he's he's depicting Aurangzeb as a despot, but as a benevolent ruler. But again, it's a part of the broader colonial epistemology because when you look into the idea, the way he's writing about Orient is interesting because he's inspired by Orient, he's depicting all the previous ruler as a bigoted, as a not bigoted, but as a they are marked by the despotism, they are marked by the benevolence, okay, especially in case of Mughal. But at the same time, when we look into his writing, when he's talking about other ruler of the subcontinent, basically the previous ruler, so in that he's basically arguing how the invasion was of Muhammad Qasim and then Muhammad Gauri and then Mahmud of Ghazni, how these invasion are actually the creator of the trouble, but not the Mughal rule. Okay, because I think why he's not writing about the Mughal rule, because they have recently received the Farman from Shah Alam. This is what I feel. I have to read about it and try to think about more.
Okay, Aditi.
Aditi?
Hi. Thank you, Soumya. Thank you, sir. Also, thank you, Anas, for your wonderful presentation. So my question is to Anas. So as you were deconstructing and remaking the image of Aurangzeb through the colonial records, in a sense, writing the historiography of Aurangzeb himself, I was wondering what kind of the archives the colonial students are using, and if you have found any very explicit and stark contrast in their narrative and the sources that they were using. That's my first question, and very much related to that is how do you think our I mean that's also partially answered with Akshit's question about the ideological framework, but I was just wondering if we read the contemporary sources of Aurangzeb and if we move ahead and read the colonial archives, is there any hegemonic, overarching idea that comes across? Is the narrative largely the same? Is it changing?
Okay. So yeah, so the first point is I'm looking into, since you talked about my sources in the first question, if I'm right, and the second is about how this idea of Aurangzeb, like, hegemonic idea of Aurangzeb, seen or implemented, or maybe like, how it could be depicted in the nationalist and the post-colonial writing, if I'm not wrong. This is what you have asked, Aditi? These two questions, if I have got you right.
Yeah. I mean, the kind of sources that they are using because
So the
they're writing,
sources,
reconstructing their history. Yeah.
So when we look into the sources, so the sources are basically, I'm looking into the sources which was compiled by colonial officers and Orientalists. Okay, the in form of, history of India, history of Hindustan, or in, like, in that how Aurangzeb has been depicted. And then I'm looking into how in the other sources, like, the most important, specifically written on Aurangzeb, like, in the late 19th century. Uh, in the late 19th century. And then the third is basically how Aurangzeb has been seen in also the regional sources, okay, in the regional history or the regional construction of history. So, and how Aurangzeb has been seen in particular region. So when we look into the hegemonic, answering your second question, like, when we look into the hegemonic idea of Aurangzeb, like, certain category, when we look into the idea, like, for example, the Hindu-Muslim binary, the way we see today, it was there in the nationalist argument. They are actually talking about it. They are actually critiquing the idea, and they are actually interacting with the colonial archive when we look into the nationalist period. And some of them are also, like, bound to the colonial archive. They are, because since they are trained into the colonial education system. So in this context, the hegemonic idea is basically how the episteme, the knowledge formation, which was obviously, which Akshit was saying, how it was marked by the ideology, obviously, but it has certain connection with the political legitimization of the British East India Company. So obviously they have to depict medieval ruler as bad as they can. So in that context, when we look into the idea that they have created of Aurangzeb as a bigot, as a Muslim bigot, and then as a Sunni bigot, and how his policy was marked by his religion, marked or inspired from the religion. So in this context, when we look into the nationalist writings, so they're contesting this idea of them. I'm not saying all of them. So the narrative that is building over a period of time is very important. This is what I'm looking into. I hope I have answered your question.
Just one small bit, Anas, that I was actually looking more into how the colonial historians are using their sources, and if there is a stark contrast in the contemporary representation of Aurangzeb. By contemporary, I mean the works that were written in Aurangzeb's time, and then also the same sources which were then used to construct a history of Aurangzeb.
Okay, so when we look into so when we look into the contemporary sources of Aurangzeb, some of the texts became hegemonic to talk about Aurangzeb bigotry, like, Muntakhabul Lubab. So this text was actually used by first time by Mount Stuart Elphiston. He translated it, and then he used it in his writing to construct certain categories, right? And when we look into the Eliot and Dawson, so they are actually selectively translating, selectively editing, selectively focusing on Aurangzeb by creating certain categories of, like, Muslim bigot, because the colonial history with the idea of James Neal, because obviously the text of James Neal, the history of India, became a hegemonic text. It was used to train the civil servant, and these people, those who are writing history, this colonial officers, because they were the colonial officers, okay, also those who are writing history in the 19th century, okay. So what they are doing is actually they are selectively translated, and then they have created certain categories.
Thank you so much, Anas.
I think Mukarram wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you, sir. I actually have questions for all three.
Good. Please go ahead.
Yes, to begin with, Anas, and this links perhaps to Aditi's question also about temporary sources. You mentioned Alexander Dow had used a number of sources which were medieval sources. And your argument seems to be that that somehow down the line, Kafi Khan's texts became the main source. So I was wondering if the other sources that Alexander Dow had relied on, are they available for use, or are they lost, or what is the condition of that? And the second question for us again was, the narrations about Aurangzeb as a pious person, as one who used to make caps and was and used to do calligraphy for his personal living, and who used not to take from the treasury. Can you tell us more about those narrations? What are these sources of those narrations? And then for Ghazala, I had a question to which the answer not be as straightforward, but do the reformists use the word Wahhabi for themselves? And is there any connection between the terms Wahhabi, Salafi, and Ahle Hadith? Is there an overlap? Is there a distinction to be drawn? So that was what I wanted some clarification on. And then for Hukum, Chandra, I was wanting to know more about what is Sampradaya, and also about this I might have missed in the presentation, but about being a sadhu, what does it entail, and does it liberate one from the caste order? So thank you.
Thanks, Mukarram. So, would like to go first? Mukarram had questions for all three papers. Anas, perhaps we'll ask Ghazala to go first. Yeah, if that's okay with you, Anas.
Yeah, I'm completely fine, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Ghazala.
Yes, sir. So, thank you for the question, Mukarram. So, you were asking regarding, do the reformists say this word Wahabi for themselves? Actually, I'm still going under process. So, I will basically, I haven't gone through this, that whether the reformists say this word that Wahabi themselves. Basically, their tendencies are revivalists. So, I still need to go that, do the reformists say this word Wahabi themselves? Another question is distinction can be drawn between Salafi, Ahl Hadith. I think you must be asking this question, Mukarram. Mukarram, can you repeat the second question?
Yes, I think, I mean, I'm just in a certain sense, they seem to be all the same, but I was sometimes, one has heard people say that they are not the same. So I'm not sure myself. So I was wanting to know if you had an opinion on this.
Yes. Like here, one question that Wahhabis admitted the right of Ishtihad, right to form judgment independent of the four schools, that is four schools of thoughts. So, and strictly emphasize the principle of Tawheed. Like I says that they're basically, I mean to say, so this is about revivalist tendencies, and their doctrine is basically based on Quran and this Hadith. Basically, they focus on Quran and Hadith. So, and I think so. If
I think there is, I mean, a confusion which does not seem to have been sort of clarified, generally speaking. So, but I think that is the key point that you're pointing out, that that there is a certain independence from the four schools of law within this situation. So I think that is sort of the defining feature, and the other names are sort of really unclear, and different people make different distinctions. Yeah, that's. I just wanted to know if there was some more. Thank you, Azam.
okay, sorry if I'm not able to able to frame your if I'm not able to say the right answer to your question. So as you see,
Ghazala, you don't have to give answers. This is a discussion in which these are issues which you should ponder over. And so, Mukarram, what is sort of drawing your attention to, this kind of problem that is there about, and this has been discussed in writings on the Wahhabis about how, these labels get used. So just think about it. I think, you need to give answers. And I think that's the purpose of a discussion and a seminar like this. Okay. Yeah. So, and this question, in the context of what Mukarram was pointing out, I think we need to be a little attentive to these the way the labels are used, particularly in writings by colonial administrators like Hunter. I'm reminded of this paper which was written by Iqtidar Alam Khan a couple of years back, which was a kind of critique of an older piece by K.M. Ashraf on 1857, where K.M. Ashraf had talked about the role of the Wahhabis in 1857 and how they provided the ideological framework, the organizational framework for a lot of the during the course of the uprising. And Iqtidar Alam Khan, in this paper which he wrote about, I think it was around 2007, was that K.M. Ashraf might have been mistaken about the role of the Wahhabis, because even the use of the term Wahhabi has a problem. He was actually using this term for the Ahle Hadith rather than the Wahhabis, and also the assumption that they were opposed to British rule cannot be taken for granted. In fact, he actually pointed out, provided several examples of how actually the interests of the Wahhabis in 1857 were actually aligned with the British rather than being opposed to them. So, and even this as a general term, as a general umbrella term, which is the sense in which it came to be used by the British in the late 19th century, I think that's also a problem, and we need to be attentive to that. Yeah. So thank you both, Ghazala and Mukarram, for this. And now, now we'll ask Hukum Chandra, because there was a question for him, and then we'll get back to Anas. Yeah. Hukum Chandra.
Yes. Yes, sir. First of all, the question of Mukarram, Sampradaya, Sadhu and caste liberation.
Yes, that is right. Thank you.
एक्चुअली रामानंदी संप्रदाय कास्ट रिफॉर्मिस्ट के रूप में स्टार्ट होता है. उसके बाद क्या, जब रिक्रूटमेंट पॉलिसी वो अपनाते हैं तो बहुत सारी डिफरेंट कम्युनिटीज के लोगों को पहले वो रिक्रूट करते हैं रामानंदी संप्रदाय में. उसके बाद थोड़े टाइम के बाद फिर आपस में जब मोनास्ट्री के अंदर, जो संप्रदाय के अंदर बहुत सारे पदों को लेकर, चाहे वो महंत हो, भंडारी हो, कोठारी हो, उनको लेकर उनमें डिस्प्यूट स्टार्ट होता है. और फिर वो डिस्प्यूट धीरे धीरे अपनी कास्ट मोनास्ट्री की तरफ मूव करता है. और 19th सेंचुरी में जो कास्ट लिबरेशन थ्रू मोनास्ट्रीज है, अलग अलग जातियों के जो अलग अलग मंदिर हैं, मैं अयोध्या 2-3-4 बार गया हूं, जिसमें मतलब तकरीबन 4000 मंदिर हैं. उसमें से 10-12 ऐसे मंदिर हैं जो डायरेक्ट जातियों से जुड़े हुए मंदिर हैं, जिसमें भंडार मतलब हेड, चीफ हेड से लगाकर, और जो वहां पे जो मैनुअल वर्क करने वाले लोग हैं सेम कम्युनिटी के हैं। और दूसरी सबसे इंटरेस्टिंग बात यह है कि जो वहाँ जाने वाले लोग हैं, जो मंदिरों में जो लोग विजिट करते हैं, वो भी सेम कम्युनिटी से हैं। तो मुझे जो समझ आता है वो ये समझ आता है कि एक तरह से जो रिफॉर्मिस्ट एजेंडा था वो कहीं ना कहीं कास्ट मोनास्ट्री में बदलता हुआ नजर आता है।
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hukum Chandra. Okay, and Anas, would you like to
thank you, Mukarram. Thank you, Mukarram, for your question. So, when we, since you are asking about the sources, like, which Dow is using for writing about Aurangzeb, so in his advertisement section, he talked about sources which was written, which was actually collected by him, and then he like, rendered it, and then he made this. Okay, but these sources are there. Like, Muhammad Kazim Khan's Alamgir Nama is there, and it's a 10-year history, and then Bakhtabar Khan Miratul Alam, and these texts was obviously, when we look into the text which was read by Dow, was also read by Mount Stuart Elphiston, and it was also read by Eliot and Dowson. They have also translated it. But again, when we see the translation, the way they have done, is obviously like, with certain condition, because when we look into the Mount Stuart Elphiston writing, he is basically, when you read his 7th volume, which he has written on Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. So in that, he's basically talking about how he talked about many sources, and then he selectively talked about, not about the Dow source, but in detail. But he actually bringing Kafi Khan to talk about the history of Maratha, like mostly, like, Aurangzeb history is filled with history of Maratha in the colonial history. How colonial, his category was created on like, this category of Hindu Maratha and Aurangzeb, Muslim Aurangzeb was created in that in the Kafi Khan's work, but not here. Like, when Alexander Dow is using, he's using these sources, which actually pointed out how Aurangzeb has been seen, like, because this is the official text or official history. And when we look into the Muhammad Kafi Khan, like Kafi Khan's history, so it's written very late, 30 years after the death of Aurangzeb. It was not a contemporaneous text. But these texts, because Muhammad Kazim Khan's Alamgir Nama and Bakhtabar Khan Miratul Alam, it was like, it was from Aurangzeb's period. So when Aurangzeb, when we look into this idea of like, the condition of this text, so condition, like, we have this text with us. So, but the selectively it was like, read. So in the later period. So, and what are the sources? Since you asked about the sources for Aurangzeb's character, okay, because since he was so shown as a pious, so obviously, like, when you read Muhammad Kazim Khan's Alamgir Nama, the initial 10-year history of Aurangzeb, in that he speaks about the Aurangzeb's character, okay, like basically how he's pious.
All right. Yes, I think that answers. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks, Anas. I think Manisha ji, आपका question है?
Good morning, sir, and good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you.
Morning.
My question is for Hukum Chandra, just a query, even if it's not even a question, I believe. Hukum Chandra ji, क्या आपको कोई भी link देखने को मिलता है? Because Awadh, you are talking in late 18th and 19th century. Do you find any connect from the Jaipur Sampradaya? Because we all know the Jaipur kings were constantly here, and when these people came or they tried to establish some very significant station there, like we have, Bhavalgarh or various others as well. So if you can just briefly put some light on this.
यस मैम जब शुरुआती संप्रदाय को इस्टेब्लिश करते हैं तो गलता वैली से अभय रामदास, तो उसमें जो पैट्रोनाइज है वो जयपुर रियासत उनको पैट्रोनाइज करती है, और वही जाके वहाँ पे जो हनुमानगढ़ी मोनास्ट्री को इस्टेब्लिश करते हैं महंत अभय रामदास, उसी और उस वहां से रामानंदी जो बैरागी है, वो वारियर बैरागी, उनका वहां से ट्रेनिंग सेंटर बहुत जगह, जो इससे पहले बहुत सारे लोगों ने जो लिखा है वो कि जो ट्रेनिंग सेंटर था वो गलता वैली था, और उसको पैट्रोनेज जयपुर रियासत करती थी 17वीं सेंचुरी में, और उसके बाद वो शिफ्ट हुआ है अयोध्या और अवध में।
हाँ, तो क्योंकि जयपुर में ये कभी डिक्लाइन नहीं हुआ, तो मैं वही पूछ रही हूँ, जैसे जयपुर वाला तो है ही, उससे कोई इनका लिंक है क्या? जैसा कि आपने शुरुआत में तो कहा कि शायद दक्षिण से, और जो भी उसकी हिस्टोरियोग्राफिकल नरेशंस हैं वो आपने दिए।
मैम, जो मेन रामानंदी मोनास्ट्री है हनुमानगढ़ी, उसका लिंक जयपुर से है, मगर उसके बाद जो कास्ट, बहुत सारे कास्ट के लोगों ने जिस तरीके से सेक्ट में इंटर किया, और फिर अलग अलग उन्होंने अपनी रामानंदी अम्ब्रेला के नीचे ही अपने मंदिर और मठ इस्टेब्लिश किए, उनका डायरेक्ट कनेक्शन जयपुर से नहीं है, जो मुझे अभी तक जो देखने में आया। और जो मेन सेंटर है हनुमानगढ़ी, उसका कनेक्शन जरूर है।
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I can see, Shakir and then Shamjeet.
Hello, sir. My question is for Ghazala. She presented paper on Wahhabis. Sir, I wanted to ask this question, that what was the role played by these Wahhabis in popularization of Urdu language? Because I have heard about Momin Khan movement, that he was also part of this movement. So did they use modern press for their movement's propaganda?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question. Yeah, they did. Like in contribution, I was trying to say, but because of lack of time, I wasn't able to say that much. So yeah, this movement gave the growth of Urdu language. Like, they laid great emphasis on the use of vernaculars in its attempt to carry its message to the masses. So that means they were working on Urdu language, and there are many texts which have been written in Urdu, and pamphlets they used to, because they think that vernacular is the only way to spread the message for the common masses. Because at that time, many people used to understand Urdu only. Like upper class, they were indulged in this Persian thing. So common people language, so they try to spread the message through Urdu, this vernacularization. So there are certain literature they focus, like like Wahabi writers were careful not to put any seditious teaching. So like their works such as Jihad Nama and Harikul Ashrar, so they preach the blessing of fighting for one's religion freedom. So these are the things they were writing. Yeah, there are certain texts like you see Tazkira Sadikpur also, in which they have mentioned about Sadikpuri family, how they were working on this. So actually, I'm still working on this. So yeah, they did a lot of things on Urdu writings. They do focus on this.
Okay,
and they gave growth of Urdu language also.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shamjeet.
गुड मॉर्निंग सर। मेरा क्वेश्चन सर, मेरा प्रश्न हुकुम चंद्रा जी से है, और मैं बस थोड़ा लिटिल बिट मेरा ये जानना है, क्वेरी है कि जो ये रामानंदी सेक्ट है डिफरेंट कास्ट के, इनका जो 20th सेंचुरी में पॉलिटिकल पैट्रोनेज टाइप कुछ था, कौन कौन से, मतलब जैसे अभी 20th सेंचुरी में जो भी पार्टी एग्जिस्टिंग थी, तो उनका पॉलिटिकल कुछ कनेक्शन था, पैट्रोनेज था उनको। और दूसरा उसी से थोड़ा सा रिलेटेड है कि जो इनका कास्ट बेस हायरार्की है, तो सर इसमें जैसे डिफरेंट कास्ट के साधुज हैं, तो उनको जैसे उनके जनेऊ संस्कार या मालाधारी सिस्टम से ऐसे कुछ संबोधित किया जाता था, तो कौन से कास्ट को कैसे वो देखते थे, शायद बस यही मेरा क्वेश्चन है।
थैंक यू श्यामजीत। जो पहला क्वेश्चन है आपका कि जनेऊ एक्चुअली जो पहले 3 वर्ण के लोग हैं, ब्राह्मण क्षत्रिय, वही लोग जनेऊ डालते हैं। बाकी लोगों को कंठी पहनाई जाती है। जो शूद्रा कम्युनिटी से अनटचेबल जो महंत हैं वो कंठी पहनते हैं। कंठी एक तुलसी का एक लकड़ी का होता है, धागे के साथ पिरोते हैं, और वो जनेऊ नहीं पहनते हैं। और दूसरा ये है कि जैसे जैसे जब वो महंत हो जाते हैं तो गंडा बांधना शुरू कर देते हैं। गंडा बोले तो वो एक माला के रूप में ही होता है, उसको वो हीराधारी बोलते हैं, जनेऊधारी नहीं। और दूसरा जो आप पॉलिटिकल पर्सनलिटीज की बात करते हैं तो 19th सेंचुरी 20th सेंचुरी में उस तरह का कोई पॉलिटिकल पर्सनल नहीं है। उसमें केवल जो कास्ट कॉन्शियसनेस है वो अलग तरह की मोनास्ट्री और मठ, चूंकि जो डिस्क्रिमिनेशन है वो जो मोनास्ट्री में जो आ गया तो वो अलग तरीके का अपने अपने फॉलोअर्स को जोड़कर एक नई मठ बनाने की प्रक्रिया में है। और जो अब राजनीतिक संरक्षण की बात करते हैं वो अभी बहुत रिसेंट फिनोमिना है। वो एक्चुअल मेरी स्टडी में उस तरह से तो नहीं है, मगर अभी चूंकि अयोध्या जब मैं विजिट किया तो उसमें जो अपनी अपनी जातियों के मठ हैं वो अपनी अपनी जातीय पार्टियों को सपोर्ट करते हैं। उसमें मेनली जो जो अपर कास्ट जो ब्राह्मण और राजपूत हैं उनका बीजेपी को समर्थन है। और अभी रिसेंटली कुछ जो नई मोनास्ट्रीज हैं जिनमें दूसरी जातियों के लोग हैं वो अपनी जातीय पार्टियों को समर्थन करते हैं।
थैंक यू सो मच।
थैंक्स चंद्रा। Nagwant, before you speak, Soumya, please keep an eye on the chat box in case there are questions over there. Yeah.
Yes, sir. After Nagwant, there's another question. I'll just.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Soumya. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So this is not my question. It's my observation, or while I am listening to Anas, and we have discussed earlier also these all processes of making Aurangzeb. So I have a question regarding the making of archive and the nature behind it. So we have so much familiarity with that processes, how archive was made and what was the active role of indigenous people. So in that context, I am asking that how we should think about the representation of Aurangzeb in the vernacular languages, because for instance in Shivraj Bhushan or Bhushan Granthavali, we have seen that Aurangzeb has been portrayed as an antagonistic, so in a very different manner. So is that kind of narrative, vernacular narrative, also influences the making of the archive colonial episteme? Or because there is a popular saying regarding Gauri's time that from it is very well known fact that Gauri Prithviraj was killed by Gauri, but there is a popular saying from Prithviraj Raso that char baas 24 gaj angul ast praman ताऊ पर सुल्तान है मत चुके चौहान. So it is a popular imagination that Prithviraj Raso, Prithviraj Chauhan has defeated the Gauri. So is that vernacular or popular narrative had any role to in the making of colonial episteme? Is there any possibility of that? Or is there, because we have known that indigenous people has actively contributed their inputs in the making of archives? So just these kind of observation I have.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. So I think when I look into this domain, if I have to talk about how colonial episteme incorporated the vernacular sources, so I think there's a very, in my case, I have not looked into the vernacular sources. The vernacular sources, I mean, when colonial episteme was employed and how they are using the vernacular sources. Okay, so this I didn't look, but the point is I have seen how Aurangzeb, like, especially in case of Do, he was depicted as a, how people are not accepting him as emperor, because of the despotic nature. So this is what he's arguing, because some of the information that he adapted, like, or he employed for reading Aurangzeb is coming from, or is skewed, like, from the material, from the vernacular sources. But I don't know much about it. Maybe I need to look.
Thanks, Amar.
Okay, thanks. Soumya?
Okay, sir. So we have a question by Ajay in the chat box. If Ajay wants to ask this question, he can mute himself and ask, or else I'll read it. Okay, I'll read it. So Anas, I think this is for you. How Emperor Aurangzeb wanted to be seen himself. We notice a continual tendency in the empire, like abolition of pilgrimage tax in 1563 and again reimposition in 1663 by Aurangzeb. Again, we see abolition of jizya in 1579 by Akbar and again reimposition in 1679 by the then emperor. Was it a mere coincidence, both the times happening just after the 100 years, or a statement Emperor Aurangzeb wanted to make?
So thank you for your question. I think how Aurangzeb wanted to see himself. When we look, this is very interesting question, because at that time there was like, the Mughal already expanded a lot, and then, like, then Aurangzeb adopted these policies, like, the policies of jizya, the policies or reimposition of jizya, or he abolished he abolished various other pilgrimage taxes also, like, he imposed jizya and then abolished other taxes. So these taxes were seen how, bigotry, like, how this was inspired from the religion, because many of the taxes were not, like, given or talked by the religion. So, but this incident, because since I'm talking about the colonial episteme, so or the making of the Aurangzeb in the colonial knowledge production. So when we look into these 1563 pilgrimage taxes and reimposition, like, how Akbar was, like, implemented that, and then in that Akbar was implemented these tax, okay, like, he abolished that tax, and then Aurangzeb was implemented this tax or reimposed this tax. So the colonial epistemology, when you look into it, or the colonial knowledge formation, when or the writing or the colonial historiography, when we look, so what they are saying is interesting, because they are also creating this category of Aurangzeb, like, bigoted Aurangzeb, and the liberal Akbar, and then orthodox Aurangzeb. So the question, like, when we look into the jizya, so obviously, like, jizya was implemented during the Aurangzeb period, and it was not a coincidence, because the jizya was implemented because it was said, like, Aurangzeb needed money, okay, and I have to look into it, what are the other sources to deal with it. But in the colonial epistemology, like, this issue was raised to mark him as a bigoted ruler. But I have to look for the contemporary sources, what they are, like, how they are referring about these issues.
Yeah, thanks. So,
I request.
Another question or comment?
No, sir. There are no questions, and now I request you to please comment.
Yeah.
Something on the papers.
So I'll just ask once more: are there any more comments or observations? Questions for our speaker? No.
If anybody has a comment or question, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Okay. So this was a very good discussion we had, and lots of things to think about, reflect on, ponder over. And there's just one or two things that I wanted to say about. I'll begin with Anas. Nothing sort of very detailed, but just a few things, which occurred to me while you were reading out your paper. So, Anas, I think, it's important also to keep in mind, since you talked about Alexander Dow, went on to James Mill, Mountstuart Elphinstone, and of course that tradition actually continues. Vincent Smith also is in that category of what we might call amateur historians. I mean, these were really administrators, and I'll put another very influential, I'll mention another very influential name, which is James Todd. They were all administrators, and for them, this was partly their own work. I mean, they had to engage with the history of the society they were dealing with. So it was partly their work, but it was also a hobby. So the point that I'm trying to make is that these were not professional historians. And professional historians would have approached their evidence, their sources in a very different way. I mean, after all, already by the 19th century, there's a very rich tradition of historical writing which uses sources in very different ways. So I think, this is something which we need to keep in mind, because when we talk about the attitude to Aurangzeb or the Mughal emperors, I think, we also, you're talking of the 1780s, but I'll go back a century and point out that the East India Company had a very long relationship with the Mughals. And it's really surprising that a lot of the company's own archive gets ignored when people are, when these administrators are writing this history. For instance, as I said, going back almost a century, Aurangzeb was a very familiar figure to the company, and it figures very prominently in the company's archive. 1689-90, the war with the Mughals, when which was primarily focused on Bombay, but also Chittagong, the other extreme, and the other sort of in the extreme east. Actually, this was a major confrontation. What's also often referred to as Child's War. There was a child who was governor of the company, but there was also a child who was governor of Bombay at that time, John Child, and this almost led to the company having to close down its operations in Western India. Remember, this is the time when the Deccan Wars are at their peak. I'm talking 1689-90, and the company's archive has such a lot of material of the negotiations which then took place with Aurangzeb, and eventually Aurangzeb had agreed to grant them a fresh farman, which allowed them to carry on their trading activities. Now, that is well-known literature, and it's really surprising that a lot of what got written in the 19th century, of course, they were using Persian and other sources, but they completely ignored that archive. Very little of that gets reflected. And there were already the company's attitude to Aurangzeb and to the Mughals had already been shaped by the time you come to the late 18th century by its long history of interaction. And if you actually look at some of the contemporary accounts of these, contemporaries of Dow, for instance, you would find that there is already this kind of understanding of Aurangzeb as a villain, as you call it, is already there in a lot of these writings, not just English, but I'm talking of a lot of the Jesuits writing around that time. I'm talking of the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s. So I think, that longer history of engagement with the Mughals and the way that shaped the narrative of the late 18th and early 19th century is something which needs to be perhaps looked at. I was also been talking about, you're talking about sources. So sources, again, the company's own archive was a valuable source, but it's invisible in most of these writings. Ghazala, there's just one point, which I wanted to, if you would like to comment on that, which is since you talk about Azimabad in a period when we have whatever the debate on it and whether people regard it as irrelevant or not. The point is that Amir Bhakti picked up a lot of the data in the context of the debate on the industrialization from the region that you are talking about. My point is that you were talking about the landed elite. You talked about also the Inam Commission. But what about how were these ideas received by the urban poor? Because there is this large section of artisans who've been rendered unemployed. And how do they, when you talk about this Wahabi, I would put that in inverted commas, or what you refer to as radical. How were these ideas received by these sections of society? If you could sort of comment on that and the implications that might have had for attitudes towards colonial rule. My comment, or rather, actually, it's a question to Hukum Chandra, is linked partly to what I said about the urban poor in the context of the Wahhabis, which is you referred to caste. In fact, I was going through your abstract, and you begin with a reference to Dumo. And also in your discussion, you were referring to, the caste in terms of commensality, connubium, particularly who eats with whom, also ritual. But I think, it's important also, and then you talk about how they, for the Ramanandis, their attitude was caste neutral. Now, this has implications for their attitude towards the property and wealth. And what kind of, how do they, after all, caste is linked to, it's also, it's not just ritual, it's not just culture, it's also about, it's not just the performative aspects, it's also about control or lack of control over means of production. So that's a dimension which I think, when you're using this term caste neutral, also needs to, they might be neutral in that towards the question of, being indifferent to who joins the sect. But what does it imply in terms of their attitude towards property and wealth? Sharing, I'm referring to the question of sharing of property and wealth. So if you would like to respond to these, Anas or Ghazala or Hukum Chandra, I'll be happy.
Yes, sir. So I want to say something, because since you're referring to the Child's War, this when I was reading into the vernacular sources in Urdu, basically they're actually criticizing company, how vernacular sources is looking into the Child's War and saying how Aurangzeb has actually, because they are glorifying Aurangzeb, so that's why they are glorifying the Child's War, how Aurangzeb thrown out the Britishers from the subcontinent at that time. So this is there in the vernacular sources. I read it. Thank you so much, sir. I will look forward, for the if you have more comments, sir. How should I frame this this idea? It would be more better.
Sure. Yeah, we'll of course have occasion to discuss your work. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Ghazala, if you have something to say.
Yes, sir. Like you are saying that how these words Wahhabi and these ideas refer to these section of people. So actually, there were certain volunteers who started volunteering in order to preach. So, what happened that I'm sorry, I'm not able to say, but yeah, I will try to say that they used to select certain khalifas, and those khalifa like Yahya Ali, he used to, their duties were basically to lecture to certain students on doctrinaire points corresponding with the district centers. So they used to dedicate in a common language, like they started focusing on this Urdu language. So at that time, we can see that Urdu, there was the growth of Urdu language because their main emphasis was how to use the, I mean to say, on the use of vernaculars, so that their message can be transferred to those local people also, those common masses also, who are not aware of their ideas. I'm still working on these things. And sir, like landed elite you were saying, so I haven't gone through this, that how poor used to get to know about this land system, like this Inam Commission. So sir, can you
No,
give
Ghazala, no, Ghazala, I wasn't, that's not what I was saying. I was saying that you talked about sections of society which had, landed property and their role. What I'm suggesting to you is that perhaps you could also see how there is literature on this, because when you're talking about the late 19th century, colonial economic policies have had an impact on on artisans, on handicraft, and there's a lot of literature on this. So obviously, how they Wahhabis, Farazis, all this, what implications this had. In fact, you could. BB Chaudhry actually has a long paper on this, which you could have a look at, and this would be useful to you for framing some of your questions and the issues that you are looking at. Yeah, thanks. I mean, these are just suggestions. It's not, you do, as I said earlier, the purpose is not that you should be giving answers. Historians never really have answers. Yeah. So
thank you, sir.
हुकुम चंद्रा
जी सर, इस पे जो आपकी जो सर क्वेरी, इसमें लैंडेड प्रॉपर्टी, सर इसमें 2-3 चीजें हैं जो मैं अभी क्लियर तो उस पे नहीं हूँ, मगर जो मैंने अभी प्राइमरली देखा है उसमें ये है कि जो रामानंदी कास्ट मोनास्ट्री है, इनके पास जो प्रॉपर्टी है वो लैंडेड प्रॉपर्टी तो है, मगर वो कहाँ से आई अभी उस पे कुछ डिटेल मुझे अभी नहीं मिला है। मगर 2 चीजें हैं जो मुझे समझ आई हैं, वो एक इनके मैनेजमेंट सिस्टम पे, कि जो अगर हम अवध के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में 2-3 चीजों का जो सर्वे अभी तक मैंने किया है, उसमें सर मोस्टली जो रामानंदी साधुज हैं या जो उनके डिसाइपल्स हैं, वो अक्सर 19th सेंचुरी में वो लोग हैं जिनके पास अच्छी लैंड होल्डिंग है, जो विलेज हेड होते हैं, मतलब नॉर्मल लेमैन उनके मतलब उस तरह से वो डिसाइपल्स नहीं हैं, और हैं भी तो उनको उतना इम्पोर्टेंस नहीं है। ये पैटर्न तो मुझे समझ, और जो मोनास्ट्री एस्टेब्लिशमेंट का जो कॉस्ट है, वो यही लैंड होल्डिंग जो फैमिलीज हैं इन्होंने वो ऑन किया हुआ है। और अयोध्या में तो एक मोनास्ट्री है जिसमें पर्टिकुलर ये मेंशन है कि किसने कितना दिया है और कब दिया है। इस तरह का जो पैटर्न है वो सर मुझे अभी तक समझ आया है।
नहीं हुकुम चंद्र, मैं असल में ये कह रहा था कि जो इनके आइडियाज हैं, प्रॉपर्टी की तरफ जो इनका एटीट्यूड है, उसमें क्या जब कहते हैं कि कास्ट न्यूट्रल हैं, वो इंडिफरेंट हैं कि उनके क्या कास्ट स्टेटस है जो ज्वाइन कर रहे हैं, क्या ज्वाइन करने के बाद उनका जो समझ है कि प्रॉपर्टी शेयर करनी चाहिए और हम लोगों को जो उनका इकोनॉमिक स्टेटस है, क्या वो भी बदल जाता है अगर लोअर कास्ट ज्वाइन करते हैं इससे?
नहीं सर, ऐसा नहीं है, ये बिल्कुल ऐसा नहीं है। पहले शुरुआती जो इनका एटीट्यूड है, अब हम 19th सेंचुरी से के आसपास देखेंगे तो जो लोग कास्ट से, ये सिर्फ डिसाइपल्स जो चेले अपने बना रहे थे ये लोग अवध के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में, उसमें कोई प्रॉपर्टी का उस तरह का कोई डिवीजन या वो प्रॉपर्टी शेयर नहीं दे रहे थे। मगर जो डिसाइपल बाद में उनको थोड़ा इंपॉर्टेंस देना स्टार्ट किए लोग, और वो फिर अपनी कम्युनिटी को ट्रेंड करते थे, और फिर वहां से जो कलेक्शंस आते थे उसके थ्रू उन्होंने मठ बनाए हैं। उनको उस प्रॉपर्टी से कुछ भी नहीं मिला। इस तरह का एक
Okay, thank you. So if there are no more questions or comments, then I'll
thank you, sir.
Thank you, Hukum Chandra. Thank you, Hukum Chandra. Thank you, Ghazala. Thank you, Anas. And I'll hand you now to Soumya.
Thank you so much, Amar sir, for taking this. And I would like to thank all the speakers. And now we will take a break for just 4-5 minutes, and then we'll continue with our second session at exactly 11:30. We'll be back.
Thank you.